Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. The rain had been falling since early evening, a relentless, cold drizzle that made the world outside shimmer like an oil painting melting underwater. The streets were nearly deserted, the wind pushing empty soda cans and damp leaves along the cracked pavement. Rookie Officer Daniel Hart pulled his collar tighter around his neck as he stepped out his cruiser, the headlights cutting across the crumbling brick exterior of Precinct 29. The building looked like it had been forgotten by time, weather-worn, stained with decades of grime. Its sign faded and partially rusted off. The only part still legible read CNCT 29. This was his first solo shift. Midnight to 8 a.m. He'd drawn the short straw, the graveyard shift. Fitting name, he thought. The precinct had officially shut down years ago, consolidated with a newer station 10 miles west. But someone had to sit in, rotate through once a week, keep the lights on and respond to any strange walk-ins, even if there weren't supposed to be any. It was protocol, an old one, but still in place. And tonight, Daniel was at someone. He pushed open the front doors and stepped into stale air. The lobby smelled of mold and old coffee. The floor tiles were cracked, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds like they were gasping for breath. The silence was immediate and heavy, like walking into a library of ghosts. He signed into the old logbook, flipping through pages filled with mostly blank spaces and the occasional scribbled initials of other officers doing their mandatory rounds. The desk sergeant station was dark. No one else was here. Daniel set his thermos down, leaned back in the chair behind the front desk, and turned on the old dispatch radio. Static greeted him. He adjusted the frequency, but no chatter came through. Dead quiet. The hours crawled. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2. The rain continued to fall outside, now harder, slamming against the thin windows. The building creaked in protest with every gust of wind. Daniel tried to keep himself busy, reviewing old files, walking the halls. Most of the doors were locked or boarded shut, holding cells empty. Evidence rooms cleaned out. Only a few lights remained on down the main corridor, bathing the floor in cold, pale blue. Then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., the dispatch radio crackled. "Hello, is someone there? Please, help me." Daniel jerked upright. The voice was faint. A woman. It came through in broken fragments, like someone talking through a storm. He turned the volume up. "Please, I don't know where I am. There's blood. He's still in the house? I think he's coming back." Daniel leaned forward. "This is Officer Hart with the police. Can you tell me your name?" No response, just the low hum of static. Then softly, "He's here?" And then the line went dead. Daniel blinked. Was this a prank? A recording? No one else should have access to this frequency. It was internal dispatch, not public. He checked the system. No call Idaho. No trace. It was as if the voice had come from nowhere. He stood up, uneasy now, his heart tapping a bit harder. He pulled up the old landline call logs. Nothing recent. No incoming calls. He checked the computer system. Dead. Just like everything else in this place. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe interference from another station. Maybe a leftover radio call from years ago. But at 2:51 a.m., the voice returned. "He's watching me." I can hear him walking upstairs. "Ma'am," Daniel said into the radio, more firmly this time. "Can you tell me your location?" Silence. Then a strange sound, like with creaking, followed by what could only be described as a slow, dragging breath. And beneath it, barely audible, a child humming. Daniel's skin went cold. He pressed the button again. "Who is this? Are you in danger?" A soft whisper now. Too faint to understand. Then the sound of a distant scream, muffled and panicked. And the transmission cut out once more. Daniel sat frozen. Every instinct in him said this wasn't just a prank. It didn't feel right. The voice had pain in it, desperation. Real. He stood, heart thudding, and walked to the radio room deeper in the station. Dust coated the equipment, most of it long defunct. But the main console still had power, running on backup. He rewound the last audio log, played it again. Nothing. Dead air. He played it again. Still nothing. He stared at the screen. The timestamp was there, 2:43 a.m., 2:51 a.m., but no audio, no waveforms, no voice. The call had never been recorded, or it had never happened. He rubbed his face, stepping back out into the main hall. That's when he noticed it. The door at the far end of the corridor was slightly open. The records room. He was sure he'd checked it earlier and locked it. A draft whispered through the hall as he approached. The light above the door flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across the wall. He reached for his flashlight, clicked it on, and pushed the door open slowly. Inside was pitch black. Rows of old filing cabinets loomed in the darkness like grave markers. Papers rustled faintly as if stirred by breath. He swept the beam across the room, stopping when it landed on the far corner. A single file box was sitting on the floor, lid half off, contents spilled. The label on the front read, Case number 047, Officer Allen R., deceased. Daniel crouched, brushing aside the dust and lifting a few of the pages. The ink was faded, but the story began to emerge. Officer Allen was killed during a domestic call 15 years ago. He'd responded to a distress call from a woman claiming her ex-husband had broken in. Backup never arrived. His body was found in the kitchen, stabbed 13 times. The woman was never located. The house was burned down shortly after. Suspect vanished. But the details Daniel's breath caught. The transcript of the 911 call. It was the same voice he'd heard, word for word. He felt a chill down his spine. He dropped the file, staggered back, heart pounding. Then the power went out. Everything, the lights, the humming, the software, the monitors, died in an instant. The station fell into darkness, save for the dim moonlight through the broken window slats. The flashlight flickered in his hand. The beam dimmed for a moment, then surged back, and there, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure, a man in a torn officer's uniform, pale, dripping, eyes wide, as if still caught in the moment of his own death. His mouth opened slowly. "Where were you when I called for help?" Daniel's breath caught. He stumbled back, flashlight beam wavering. The figure took a step forward, boots echoing on the tile. "I was alone." Daniel turned and ran. Down the corridor, past the old cells, through the locker room. Everything around him groaned and moaned, like the building itself was waking up. Lights flickered erratically, flashing brief images. Officers with blank faces, blood dripping from the ceiling. Radios crackling with impossible voices. He burst into the lobby, chest heaving, and slammed the door shut behind him. Silence. Darkness. The station seemed still again. But the radio on the desk began to crackle once more. And this time, it was his own voice on the other end. "This is Officer Hart, please. Someone, if anyone's out there, help me." Daniel didn't sleep. He didn't sit. He paced. For the next 20 minutes, he kept checking the front door of the precinct, half hoping someone might walk in, that backup might arrive, that a senior officer might call in and explain this was some sick hazing tradition. But the radio on the desk just hissed in steady static, and outside, the rain had turned to a thin, frozen mist that clung to the windows like ash. He replayed the voice again, the voice that wasn't his and yet was his words, his inflection, desperation, fear, panic, broadcasted back at him like a mirror warped in sound. "This is Officer Hart. Please, someone help me." It repeated every 5 minutes, exactly. The timestamp never changed, 2:59 a.m., but it looped, like a broken cry for help etched into the bones of the building. Daniel left the radio alone, and made his way back down the corridor. Every step echoed louder than it should have. His flashlight, flickering still, cut across the walls which were now lined with peeling paint that looked more like torn flesh under weak lighting. The records room door still hung open. He didn't dare go in again. Instead, he veered left toward the locker rooms. Maybe there was something useful left behind. A weapon, a phone, a clue, anything. Inside, rows of metal lockers stood crooked and rusted, names etched in black marker, long faded. Rodriguez, Bailey R., Allen, the same name as the murdered officer. Daniel's hand hovered over the locker door. It was slightly ajar. He took a breath and pulled it open. Inside was a dusty service belt, an old flashlight with a dead battery, and a sealed plastic evidence bag containing a blood-stained badge. Officer Allen's badge. Scratched. Bent. Number barely visible. 3746. Daniel's chest tightened. Behind it was a small, folded photograph taped to the inside of the locker. He peeled it off carefully. It was of a man, Officer Allen, judging by the name, posing with a woman and child in front of a modest two-story house. The address was handwritten on the back, 1375 Willow Creek Lane. Daniel blinked. That address sounded familiar. He pulled his notebook out and flipped through the few case files he'd skimmed earlier. There was again 1375 Willow Creek, the house where the murder happened 15 years ago. The same one the mysterious woman had called from. Tonight, he stared at the photo. Something in it made him uneasy. The house in the background looked wrong, blurry, like it was moving. And the woman, her eyes seemed to follow him, even in the dim light. Suddenly, the lights in the locker room blinked on. He hadn't touched anything. The fluorescent bulbs above him buzzed back to life with a strange, high-pitched whine. Daniel looked up slowly and saw his reflection in the dusty mirror across the room. Only, it wasn't quite his reflection. It was him, but older, tired, pale. His eyes looked dead. And then the reflection smiled. Daniel stepped back, knocking into the lockers behind him. When he looked again, the mirror was cracked, and it showed only himself, just himself, wide-eyed and sweating. A sudden clang echoed from the hallway. He spun, flashlight ready. Nothing, but the sound came again, closer this time, like a cell door slamming shut. He moved down the hallway, slow and careful, each step like a drumbeat in his chest. He passed the booking area, where fingerprint stations gathered dust and the mugshot camera sat with shattered lens. Then, through the darkness, he saw it, one of the holding cell doors swinging gently open. Back and forth, back and forth. Daniel stepped inside. The air was colder here, damp. He felt it in his bones. There was graffiti on the walls, names, dates, nonsense scribbles, and one phrase that kept repeating, "Time doesn't forgive." He checked the cell. Empty, but as he turned to leave, he heard breathing. Not his own. Slow, heavy, coming from the next cell over. He inched forward, shone his light. A figure was crouched in the corner, back to the door. Pale skin, blood-soaked clothes. Its hands were covering its ears, rocking slowly. "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. He stepped closer. His flashlight beam trembled in his grip. Then the figure turned around. It was a woman from a photograph, but her face, it was torn, distorted. One eye was missing, the other wide and lifeless. Her mouth hung open, blood crusted along her chin. "Help me," she whispered. Daniel stumbled back. The door to the cell slammed shut. He grabbed at the bars, pulling, yanking. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, the woman began to scream. Not words, but an inhuman wail that shook the metal walls. The lights above him exploded, showering sparks. And through the screaming came that same sound again, humming, a child's tune. The door burst open, as if kicked from the other side. Daniel rolled into the hall, scrambling to his feet, flashlight barely working now. He ran, back down the hall, past the records room, toward the lobby. He stopped short. The front doors were gone. Where the double glass doors had been was now just wall. Seamless brick wall. No sign they'd ever existed. He turned, heart hammering in his chest. The precinct had changed. Hallways twisted into new shapes. Doors he'd opened were now sealed. Stairwells led into pitch black drops. And everywhere, that humming, closer now, like the child was following. The air grew thick, heavy with rot and decay. And in the distance, he could hear radios crackling, dozens of them, layered voices overlapping. Shots fired. Officer down, need backup. Can anyone hear he's still in the house? Oh God, why won't they pick up he's in the walls? He's... Daniel fell to his knees, clutching his head. It was too much. The noise, the fear. He was alone. And then, a hand on his shoulder. He spun. No one. Just a message written on the wall behind him in dripping black. You're next. He backed away, tripped over something. Looked down. It was the badge. Not Officer Allen's. His own. Number 8127. Bent. Scratched. Fresh blood smeared across the numbers. And a whisper in his ear. Your shift isn't over. The world tilted. And he was back at the front desk. Like nothing had happened. The lights were on. The clock read 2 a.m. The rain outside pattered lightly against the glass. His thermos sat unopened beside the dispatch radio. He blinked, reached out to touch it, still warm. He looked down at his hands, trembling, but clean. No blood, no dirt, not a single sign he'd moved from that desk. Was it a dream? A hallucination? The radio hissed softly, then calmly, "This is Officer Hart. Please, someone help me." The same words, same voice, same loop, only this time, he wasn't just hearing it. He was watching himself say them. His reflection, faint in the black screen of the radio, was mouthing the words, in perfect sync. And then the lights dimmed, and the shift started again. Daniel didn't remember falling asleep, but when his eyes opened, the clock on the wall said 2 a.m. again. Exactly the same. The rain was still tapping at the windows. The same cold cup of coffee sat at his elbow, untouched. His badge lay neatly clipped to his chest, and his flashlight, fully charged, rested on the counter. No broken lights. No blood. No twisted hallways. No screams. Just silence. Too much silence. Daniel stood up slowly, testing the floor beneath him like he expected it to give way. It didn't, but something inside him had shifted. The air felt heavier now, the shadows darker. Everything had a faint blur to it, like the entire building had been dusted in static. He glanced at the phone. No missed calls. And yet, he knew it was coming. As if on cue, the radio behind him crackled. "This is Officer Hart. Please, someone help me." Same voice, same desperation, same impossible timestamp. 2:59 a.m. Daniel closed his eyes, gritting his teeth. It was a loop, a prison of hours and voices. But why? And more importantly, how was he supposed to escape? He thought of the photograph again. The address, 1375 Willow Creek Lane. That's where it all began. He grabbed the keys hanging from the hook on the back wall. Still dusty, still labeled Unit 7. The old patrol car sat just outside the station, parked under the flickering street lamp. He'd checked earlier. The tank was full. The engine worked. But something had stopped him then. Fear, maybe. Now it was different. Now he was going. The keys turned in the ignition with a sputter and a growl, and the old cruiser rolled out into the night. The roads were dead. No traffic. No other headlights. No signs of life anywhere. As he drove, the city seemed to peel away around him. Street signs were blank. Buildings had no windows. All of it looked like cardboard scenery in a forgotten play, like the world was fading out. But then he saw it. 1375 Willow Creek Lane. Exactly like the photo. The same creaky porch. The same split rail fence. The windows, still boarded up, Yellow police tape long since shredded by wind. And inside, a single light was on. Daniel parked at the curb, heart in his throat. Every nerve told him to leave, to run, to burn the place down and forget he ever heard that voice on the radio. But he couldn't, because that voice was him. He stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The boards creaked underfoot. The door opened on its own. The air inside smelled like mildew, rot, and something worse, something burnt and ancient. Daniel stepped in. The hallway stretched longer than it should. Too long, and the walls pulsed like veins, wet and throbbing beneath the wallpaper. He passed a shattered mirror in the foyer. It didn't reflect him. It showed Officer Allen. Same uniform, same badge, but his throat was slit. Blood pooled at his collar. He was mouthing something silently, again and again. Time doesn't forgive. Daniel stepped deeper inside. The living room was frozen in time. Toys scattered on the floor. A broken television flashing white static. And a photograph on the mantel of Alan, his wife, and their daughter. All three had their eyes burned out. Then came the humming. That child's tune again. He turned toward the hallway. There was a door at the end, one he hadn't noticed before. Wooden, carved with names. His name, Alan's name, other names. Too many to count. Daniel reached the knob. His hand passed through it. The door began to melt. The hallway stretched again, longer this time, until the walls fell away, and he was back, at the precinct, behind the front desk. 2 a.m. It never changed. He screamed, but no one heard. He tore the microphone off the radio, smashing it against the desk until it cracked apart. Still, the voice came. "This is Officer Hart. Please, someone help me." And the worst part, he could see the loop now, not just hear it. The station had become a maze of overlapping timelines. He passed versions of himself in every hallway, each one trapped in a different moment. One frantically dialing a phone that wouldn't ring. One dragging himself down a hallway, bleeding from the eyes. One banging on the front doors that were no longer there. All of them doomed. He was every voice on the radio. He was every scream in the walls. He was a shift that never ended. And so was Alan, and Rodriguez, and Bailey, and all the names on that door. They had all tried to leave. None of them had. Daniel tried one last thing. He ran to the evidence room. There, under flickering lights, he found the original call log, the first report from 15 years ago. A woman named Grace Allen. She had called from the house, said her husband had snapped, said the police weren't coming, that the house was eating them alive, but there was no follow-up report, because the officer who responded was Daniel Hart. His name was on the dispatch record, but that wasn't possible. He hadn't even been a cop back then. He hadn't been old enough. He wasn't born until 2 years later. He checked again. Same name, same badge number. Officer Daniel Hart, missing since March 3rd, 2010, declared dead in absentia. He stumbled back. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't trapped in time. He was time, a leftover echo, a recycled soul, a scream fed back into the same building, decade after decade. He was a ghost haunting his own shift, and the moment he realized it, the phone rang. For the first time, Daniel picked it up, hand shaking. The voice on the other end was soft. "I told you not to answer it." Then silence. The lights died, and when they came back on, there was no station, no floor beneath him, no sky above, only the radio, floating in darkness, whispering his name on repeat. And somewhere in a quiet town in America, a new rookie officer walked into Precinct 29 for the first time. He checked in. He smiled at the silence. And behind the desk, an old radio crackled. "This is Officer Hart. Please, someone help me." Story 2. The old station smelled like rust, mold, and memory. Detective Ray Mercer hadn't set foot inside Precinct 12 in over a decade. Not since the department closed it down after the merger with the Central District. Now, the city wanted it cleared, cataloged, and gutted for renovation. Historic value, they said. Preservation. As if the ghosts that linger in the corners of this place would ever agree to being showcased on a brochure. Ray wasn't sentimental. He'd been on the force for 30 years. He'd seen enough crime scenes, body bags, and confessions to know nostalgia could be a dangerous drug. But something about this building made his skin crawl. Not because of what happened in it, but what was never fully explained. He pulled the light chain in the main corridor. A row of flickering bulbs came to life, buzzing like hornets. The shadows clung to the corners like old regrets. Dust floated thick in the air, coating everything with that dull gray stillness found only in forgotten places. Ray's boots echoed as he walked past the old bullpen, now stripped of computers and phones. Only a few chairs remained, and the dried coffee rings on the desks looked like fossilized chaos. The storage hallway was at the far end, just past the old holding cells. Rows of lockers lined the corridor, each labeled with a brass tag. Names of officers who hadn't worked here in years. Some were dead, some retired. A few, Ray knew, had never quite made it out. He checked the manifest. Each locker was numbered and accounted for. All but one. Locker 119. There was number 119 on the list. He walked the row again, counting aloud this time, flashlight beam trailing over the rusted handles. 115, 116, 117. Then he paused. Number 118, number 120. But there it was, slotted neatly between them. A black locker, unlike the others. No tag, no lock, just a small, scratch number carved into the steel. 119. Ray exhaled slowly, the air misting in front of him despite the warmth. This locker shouldn't exist. And yet it did. He reached for the handle, hesitating just long enough to ask himself if this was a mistake. Then he pulled. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded almost resentful. Inside was a single cardboard box, unmarked and sealed with brittle yellowing tape. He slid it out, heart suddenly heavy. The box bore no case number. Just a single slip of paper taped to the top. Do not open. Case closed. Ray stared at the words for a long time. Then he opened it. The air that escaped smelled like wet earth and copper. Inside were photos, crime scene photos. Grainy, old, but Ray recognized the layout of the rooms, the positions of the bodies. A series of murders from a case he barely remembered, filed away somewhere in the back of his mind like a half-forgotten nightmare. The Hollow Creek killings. 6 victims. All young men. All strangled. Each body posed in a chair, arms neatly folded in their lap, shoes removed and placed beside them. The killer had been caught, convicted, died in prison. Case closed. Except this evidence wasn't part of that file. These photos were different, more recent. The victims in these weren't from 20 years ago. They were new, one dated just 3 months back. Ray's hands trembled as he flipped through the rest. There were receipts, a blood-stained tie, a child's drawing of a man with black eyes and no mouth, and at the bottom of the box, something that froze him completely, a picture of his old partner, Jacob Dunn, smiling, seated in a chair, arms folded, shoes placed beside him. Ray staggered back. Jacob had retired years ago, moved out west. They'd spoken on the phone 6 weeks ago. He'd sounded fine, healthy. This photo was dated last week. Ray slammed the locker shut and turned away, but the hallway seemed longer now, darker. The lights overhead buzzed louder, flickering faster. He moved fast, faster than he should have for his age, back toward the main office. His phone had no signal. The front doors were locked. No matter how hard he pulled, they wouldn't budge. Something shifted behind him. Footsteps, but not solid ones. The kind that echoed from walls, bounced through memories. He turned, flashlight sweeping the hall. No one there, but the locker was open again. Ray grabbed the box, marched it into the former captain's office, and dropped it on the desk. He opened his notepad and began writing, documenting everything. He wasn't going crazy. He needed proof. He needed someone else to see this. He called dispatch on the landline. The old rotary buzzed before connecting. A young voice answered, thin and distant. Dispatch. State your call. This is Detective Mercer. Precinct 12. I'm in the building clearing evidence. I need a supervisor down here. Now. Silence. Then the voice said, Detective Mercer died in 2009. This number is not in service. Click. The line went dead. Ray stared at the receiver, a cold knot forming in his gut. His fingers went numb. Outside the office door, the hallway lights blinked out, one by one, in a slow crawl of darkness. And then, a knock on the door. 3 soft taps. He didn't answer, didn't move. The knock came again, closer this time. Ray reached for the evidence box again, pulling out the photo of Jacob. His partner was missing, maybe dead. But this case, this box, this locker, it wasn't just reopening the past. It was consuming it. The door creaked open. No one there. But on the desk now, beside the box, sat a shoe. A man's dress shoe. And another photo. Of himself. Seated. Smiling. Arms folded. Shoes off. Detective Ray Mercer didn't sleep that night. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. After what he'd seen, what he'd heard, closing his eyes felt like surrender, like giving up his last line of defense against whatever was clawing its way out of the shadows inside Precinct 12. The photo still sat in front of him, his own face, same weathered features, same silver hair, seated just like the others. The date scrawled in the corner said May 7th, today. He hadn't taken that photo. He hadn't sat in that pose. And yet, there it was, printed in the same grim black and white tones as all the others. Ray locked the photo in his satchel and left the captain's office, walking slowly through the dead precinct. The building seemed quieter than before, too quiet. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights had gone. The air felt pressurized, like walking inside a submarine deep underwater. He needed help, not just because he was in over his head, but because someone else had to see this. Someone else had to confirm he wasn't going mad. The building's main entrance remained jammed, the metal doors bolted shut from the inside, with no visible mechanism. It didn't make sense. He'd walked through them that morning. Now they stood like a sealed tomb. He headed back toward the locker hallway. This time, he counted carefully. 115, 116, 117, number 118. Then, still there, still open. Inside the locker, the box was gone. In its place was something worse. A recorder. The old handheld kind, like the ones they used for interrogation tapes back in the 90s. A cassette already slotted in, the play button flickering with a dim green glow. Ray hesitated, then pressed play. A burst of static. Then a voice. Familiar. His own voice. I think it started with the photo. I shouldn't have opened the box. I think the locker wasn't meant to be found. I think. Static again. Then, Jacob's gone. They said he moved. But he didn't. He died in that chair. And now I see them. The others. All the ones from the Hollow Creek case. I think they're still here. I think we never caught the right man. Or maybe the right man wasn't a man at all. Click. Silence. Ray dropped the recorder. It wasn't just his voice. It was a version of himself he hadn't been yet. The man in that recording sounded broken, hollowed out, like he'd seen something on the other side of sanity, and stayed there. He backed away from the locker. That's when the hallway light snapped back on, every bulb stuttering violently, casting sharp shadows that danced across the walls. And then, at the far end of the corridor, a figure, unmoving, dressed like a cop, head tilted, eyes vacant. A man, shoes missing, arms folded across his lap, sitting in a chair that hadn't been there a moment before. Ray's breath hitched. The figure looked exactly like Officer Brent Mallory, but Mallory had died in 2006. Gunshot. Suicide. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. But there he sat, staring through rays of time had folded in on itself. And then the whispering started. Soft, all around. Layered voices. All male. All familiar. He found the locker. The case was closed. But he opened it. He opened it. He opened it. Ray turned in place, trying to locate the source. But the voices weren't coming from one direction. They were inside the walls. Inside the ceiling. Inside him. He sprinted down the hallway, past the phantom of Mallory, past the locker, past the cells, until he reached the evidence room. He'd cleared this place out 10 years ago. He remembered boxing up the files. But the shelves were full again. Thick folders lined the walls, everyone stamped with the same red word. Active. He pulled one down. A familiar name. Officer Darren Fields. Dead. 2003. Overdose. But inside the folder, photos from this year. A scene that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe hadn't happened here. In one photo, Darren was lying in a hallway identical to this one. Same stained tiles. Same flickering light. Mouth open in silent horror. Ray grabbed another file. Sergeant Mike Cordes. Another photo. Another death. Another chair. All posed the same. Ray opened file after file. Hands shaking. Blood pounding in his ears. Dozens of officers. All from his old squad. All listed as active. All already dead. One file was thicker than the others. He opened it slowly. Detective Raymond Mercer. His own name. A full case sheet. Empty morgue toe tag. Final cause of death. Unspecified. Time of death. Pending. And a photograph. Paper clipped to the back. Black and white. Ray. Same posture. Same expression. Only this time a new detail. Behind his seated figure stood a shadow. Tall. Elongated. And smiling. Though it had no mouth. He slammed the folder shut. Heart racing. He wasn't dealing with a case. This wasn't about unsolved murders. This was about erasure. Something in this place, something inside that locker, was rewriting history, swallowing memories and replacing facts with fate. And now it had his name. Ray ran. The precinct seemed to warp around him. Corridors twisting like a labyrinth. Doors led to places they shouldn't. Interrogation rooms opened to janitor closets. Stairwells looped back to the lobby. Every hallway held new whispers. Every corner, a flicker of movement. And then, finally, salvation. The back entrance. He slammed through the metal door and stumbled into the alley behind the station, gulping fresh air like a drowning man. Morning sunlight burned his eyes. He checked his phone. Signal restored. The station looked different. Smaller. Older. Like it hadn't been touched in decades. A pedestrian passed by, gave him a weird look, and walked on. Ray took one step forward, then another. He turned to look back at the building. But where the back door had been, there was only brick. Solid. Unbroken. Like no door had ever existed. Ray Mercer stumbled through the alley, heart pounding in his chest like it was trying to break free. His lungs burned with the fresh air, but there was no escaping the feeling that something was still chasing him. Not physically. No, it was something far worse. Something that had been planted inside his mind. The brick wall where the back door had been stood like a permanent scar on the city's face. No seams. No hinges. Just solid, unforgiving brick. As if the whole building had swallowed the exit. He turned away. He couldn't stay here. Couldn't be near it. The door, the locker, the photos, everything was connected. It was all still there, lurking in the cracks of his mind, waiting to strike. Ray moved quickly through the alley, the bustling city streets ahead offering no comfort. Cars honked. People laughed. It all felt distant. Hollow. Nothing was real anymore. Not his own reflection. Not the world outside. Not even the feeling of his own hands. He couldn't stay in this place any longer. The precinct, the locker, everything had already taken too much. Ray needed answers. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hands trembling. No missed calls. No new texts. He scrolled through the contacts until he found a name that still meant something. His old partner, Detective Lauren Hale. They'd been close. Closer than he'd ever been to anyone. She'd retired a year ago, but he knew she'd still help him. She had to. He dialed the number. It rang and rang. And just as he was about to hang up, the call connected. Her voice was warm but strained. "Ray? What's going on? You sound." "Lauren, I need you," he interrupted, his words coming out in rushed, panicked bursts. "I don't know how to explain this, but something's wrong. Something's very wrong, and I—" "Ray, slow down," she said, her tone firm now. "You're scaring me. What happened? The precinct. It's changing. The people inside it, they're dead, Lauren. All of them. But they're still there. And it's like they don't remember they're dead." Ray's words tumbled out in a chaotic mess. But Lauren didn't cut him off. She listened. It was the only thing she'd ever done well, listening when no one else would. "What are you talking about?" she asked quietly. "Ray, I haven't heard from you in months. I know things haven't been easy, but you need to come home. Let me help you. This isn't you." Ray's heart cracked with her words. The old Lauren, his partner, was gone, replaced by someone who saw him as a broken man. Someone who couldn't even fathom what had happened in Precinct 12. Someone who couldn't possibly understand the madness that had gripped his mind. But Ray wasn't mad. He couldn't be. He'd seen the photos. He'd heard his own voice, his own words. He'd witnessed the faces of the dead. And now he had to finish it. "I'm sorry, Lauren," he whispered, his grip tightening on the phone. "But I'm not coming home. Not yet." The line went dead. Ray didn't wait to listen for the dial tone. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, already heading for the one place he knew he had to go. The locker. The locker was where it had all begun, and it was the only place that could end it. No more running. No more questions. Just answers. When he arrived back at the precinct, he barely noticed the slow crawl of dread sinking deeper into his bones. The building was quieter than before, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him. The front entrance was still shut, still locked. The back was still a wall. There was no way in. But Ray knew what had to be done. He made his way around the side of the building, through a forgotten fire exit. It was unlocked. The hallway inside was just as he remembered it, dim, stifling, and unnaturally still. No whispers, no figures in the corners, just silence. He walked past the rows of lockers again. Number 118. It should have been empty, but it wasn't. The door was wide open. Ray approached it slowly, his hands trembling again. Inside the locker, there was nothing but the same empty space. No recorder, no photos, no files. Just one thing. A single folder, resting neatly on the bottom of the locker. No name, no label. Ray's breath caught in his throat as he crouched down to open it. Inside were just a few papers, case files, reports. But it was the last sheet that made him freeze. It was a photo, black and white. Ray's face again. Same expression, same pose. But this time, the figure behind him was clearer. It was tall, elongated, not human. And its smile, if it could even be called that, was more like a gaping, twisted grin. A mouth that stretched too far, revealing nothing but darkness. Ray stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as the smile began to shift, something inside him clicked. The realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just a place rewriting history. It was a person, and that person was him. The darkness in the photo began to stretch, to ripple. The edges of the paper curled, the shadows pulling inward, try and consume him. Ray tried to scream, but no sound came. Then a voice, soft, familiar. "Ray." It wasn't his own. It wasn't anyone's. It was the locker speaking. Ray was no longer in control. The walls closed in, and the story he'd been chasing for so long had just erased him. Story 3. In the small town of Hollow Ridge, the old prison on the edge of town was nothing more than a haunting relic from a time long forgotten. The thick stone wall stood like a tombstone, weathered by decades of neglect. But inside, memories still lingered. Memories of pain, suffering, and a riot that had turned everything upside down. The riot had happened in 1982, during a time when the prison had housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. For hours, the prisoners had fought back against the guards, taking control of the entire wing. It had ended in bloodshed. Guards had died. Inmates had died. And when the dust settled, the prison had decided that the wing in question, Cell Block C, was no longer fit for use. The walls were sealed shut, and the section was abandoned. No one had dared to go near it after that. Until now, 33 years later, the state decided it was time to renovate the old facility. The building had become too much of an eyesore, and the cost of maintaining it was overwhelming. Plans were drawn up to turn the place into a modern storage facility. But to do that, they needed to begin with the worst of it, the old, forgotten wing where the riot had begun. The first team to arrive were the construction workers. They came in groups, led by a man named Nick Harris, an experienced contractor with years of experience in demolition and renovation. Nick had been to his fair share of abandoned sites, but nothing had prepared him for what lay behind those walls. The workers gathered at the main entrance of Cell Block C, standing in front of the metal doors that had been sealed for over 3 decades. It was a grim sight. The rusted metal doors had not budged since the day the prison had locked them shut. "All right, fellas," Nick said, his voice gruff and full of authority. "Let's get this thing opened up. I want everything clear by tonight." They pulled out their tools, crowbars, sledgehammers, drills, and began working on the rusted locks. It took nearly an hour to break through, and when the doors finally gave way, there was an audible groan as if the building itself was sighing in relief. They were met with musty smell, a mixture of mildew and rot that seemed to suffocate the air. Nick led the crew inside, flicking on the lights of their portable lamps. The dim lights revealed long, dark corridors, broken windows, and cracked walls. It looked like any abandoned building would. But it wasn't just a physical decay that unsettled Nick. It was a feeling. The feeling that the place had been waiting for them. "We'll start with the walls first," Nick said, his voice echoing off the empty corridors. "This place is a mess, but it's salvageable. Just gotta take it slow." As the workers began their tasks, Nick walked through the old hallways, inspecting the rooms. His boots scraped the worn floors and the silence was deafening. But something caught his attention, something that didn't seem right. At the end of the hall, there was a cell, Cell 6. It was always cold, even when the rest of the wing was hot and stuffy. Nick stepped closer, shivering slightly as a chill ran down his spine. He'd been in enough abandoned places to know that temperature fluctuations weren't uncommon, but the cold in this cell was different. It felt unnatural, as if the air itself was refusing to warm up. He tried the door. It didn't budge. Locked, but the lock was old and rusted. Definitely not the kind of lock you'd find in a modern facility. Nick frowned, running his hand along the edge of the doorframe. That's when he felt it, the faintest hum beneath his fingers, as if the wall itself was alive. He pulled his hand away, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. Something was wrong here. He didn't know what, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Nick glanced around to make sure none of the other workers were paying attention. The last thing he needed was for his crew to think he was losing his nerve. But something told him that Cell 6 was more than just another locked door in an old, forgotten wing of the prison. He made a mental note to return later. As he turned to leave, the sound of whispers stopped him cold. It was faint at first, like a murmur, but then it grew louder. Faint voices, indistinguishable, but there. He spun around, searching the hallway for the source. But there was nothing. No one. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He glanced at the door to Cell 6 again. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside. But that was impossible, right? The place had been abandoned for years, and there was no one left in the prison. "Hey, Nick!" One of the workers shouted from the other end of the hallway. "We need you over here." As the days stretched on, the atmosphere in the old prison grew increasingly oppressive. The further Nick ventured into the decaying corridors of cell block C, the more he felt that strange sensation, like he wasn't alone. The whispers had stopped, but a deep unease hung in the air like a thick fog. It was almost as if the building itself was watching them, waiting. The team worked in silence, each of them focused on their tasks, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Nick noticed that a few of the workers, especially the younger ones, seemed jumpy. They glanced around nervously, avoiding the cold, empty cells and the eerily still walls. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the building. The noise from hammers, drills, and saws became a rhythmic, monotonous sound, and for a moment it felt like the prison was breathing along with them, slowly, quietly, almost as if it were alive. Around dusk, something unexpected happened. One of the workers, Tony, a tall man in his 30s, disappeared. Nick hadn't noticed at first. The team was taking a break, drinking water and stretching their legs in the main corridor when Tony wandered off to inspect the far end of the wing, near cell 6. Nick had assumed he was just checking out the area, but when a few minutes turned into 10, then 20, Nick felt a growing sense of worry. He had gone to the farthest part of the building, away from the others, where the cold was the most intense. Maybe he'd gotten lost, Nick thought, or maybe he'd found something in one of the cells. But there was still no sign of Tony when the sun had fully set, and the darkness crept inside the walls like a slow-moving tide. "Where's Tony?" Nick asked, trying to sound casual, though his stomach twisted with unease. The group looked around, some starting to shift nervously. "He was here a minute ago," one of the workers, Jim, said, his voice trembling. "Maybe he went back to the van?" Nick frowned. He knew Tony wasn't the kind of person to wander off without telling anyone, and the van was a good distance away from the building. He could hear the others' voices growing louder as the team called for Tony, but there was still no answer. Nick's heart raced. Something was wrong. He felt in his gut that deep, primal sense that something dangerous was unfolding just beneath the surface of reality. "Stay here," Nick ordered. "I'll go check the back." He moved quickly, his boots clicking against the worn tile floor, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He passed the cell doors, eyes scanning every shadow, every empty corner. His pulse quickened when he reached the far end of the hallway near cell 6. He paused in front of the door, feeling that bone-chilling cold seeping out from under it. He shivered but forced himself to approach. "Tony!" Nick called out. "Are you in there?" Nothing. Silence. Nick grasped the cold, rusted door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was old, but it seemed more solid than it had any right to be. He knocked gently on the door. Still nothing. He tried again, shaking the door harder this time, but it was like something was holding it in place, something far stronger than any lock. He cursed under his breath and moved away from the door. Where had Tony gone? He turned and called out again, his voice growing more frantic, but the hall remained eerily silent. Nick pulled his phone out of his pocket and called the other workers, but the signal was weak, flickering in and out. His frustration mounted. There had to be a logical explanation, but the longer he stood in that hallway, the more the feeling of unease deepened. The air seemed heavier, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. The cold from cell 6 wrapped around him like an invisible hand. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure, a man, standing at the end of the hall, just past the corner. He didn't move, didn't flinch when Nick called out to him. Nick's heart skipped a beat. The figure was just standing there, his back to Nick, motionless. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows. For a moment, Nick wondered if it was Tony. But the more he stared, the more he realized this wasn't Tony. The man was wearing an old-fashioned prison uniform, the same kind they used decades ago, long before the prison had been shut down. It was worn and faded, the fabric hanging loose around his frame. Nick took a step forward, his voice trembling. "Hey, you okay?" He reached out, his breath catching in his throat. But the man didn't move. He remained frozen, staring straight ahead. Something in Nick's gut told him to stop, to turn around, to walk away. But he ignored it. He couldn't. Not when one of his own was missing. "Tony!" he called, stepping closer, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The man's head turned slightly, his body still facing forward. And then, in a voice that sounded too hollow, too distant, he spoke. "They're coming for you." Nick froze, his heart stopping. The voice wasn't Tony's. It wasn't even human. It was a whisper, an echo. Before he could react, the figure vanished. One moment he was there, the next gone. Nick spun around, wide-eyed, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the stillness, the darkness. "Tony," Nick whispered again, panic rising in his chest. "Where are you?" Suddenly, the air seemed to grow colder still. Nick's breath turned to fog in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the cold from cell 6 creeping toward him, sinking into his bones. Nick stumbled backward, desperate to find the others. He needed to get out of there. This place was wrong. Something was happening, something beyond his understanding. But before he could turn, he heard it, a voice, a soft, distant murmur that echoed down the hall, coming from behind him. "We were here." It was faint, but it was there. And then he heard a low, guttural growl, deep, rasping. And that was when he realized something terrifying. He wasn't alone. Nick's body was frozen with fear as the growl reverberated through the cold, oppressive air of the hallway. It wasn't just any growl. It was something primal, filled with malice and death. His heart raced, and his breath hitched in his throat as he slowly turned around. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had heard was coming for him. He glanced over his shoulder toward the shadowy corner of the hall, but there was no sign of the man he'd seen earlier. The hallway, once full of echoes, was now suffocatingly silent. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath. With shaky steps, Nick made his way toward the main group of workers, his eyes darting around, trying to find any sign of movement, of life. He knew he had to find Tony. He couldn't leave him here. Something was terribly wrong. The cold grew even more unbearable as Nick walked past the empty cells. He could feel the oppressive weight of the prison's past pushing down on him. Every step felt like it carried the weight of something ancient, something evil. The air was heavy with secrets, and the deeper he ventured into the abandoned wing, the more it felt like the building was closing in on him. When he reached the main group, they were all gathered in a small circle, looking just as uneasy as he felt. A couple of them had flashlights in hand, their faces pale as they whispered among themselves. "Where's Tony?" Jim asked, his voice shaky. Nick didn't answer right away. He looked around at the others, wondering if they had seen what he had seen, heard what he had heard. But he couldn't tell them. Not yet. Not until he understood what was going on. "I haven't found him," Nick finally said. "But something's not right here. This place, it's not just abandoned. It's haunted. We need to leave now." A couple of the workers exchanged worried glances, but no one moved. The walls seemed to close in on them, and every breath felt like it was dragging them deeper into the darkness. Nick's eyes fell on the sealed door of cell 6 again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were hidden there, inside that cold, lifeless room. Something about that cell, that coldness, called to him. But what could he possibly find in a place that had been sealed off for decades? The voice, the one that had whispered to him, echoed in his mind like a broken record. "We were here." Before he could make a move, the door to the hallway swung open with a creak that sounded too loud in the stillness. Nick spun toward the sound, his breath catching in his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Tony. But Tony was different. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was something about him, something wrong. He was pale, his clothes torn and dirted. His face was streaked with dark, dried blood. He looked hollow, like a shell of the man he had been just hours before. "Tony," Nick whispered, his voice faltering. Tony's lips curled into a twisted grin, and Nick's heart dropped. There was no recognition in those eyes, no trace of the man he had known. "They came for me," Tony whispered, his voice hoarse and unnatural. "They're still here. They won't let me go." Nick stepped back, his pulse racing. The room grew colder still, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in even tighter. Something was wrong with Tony, something terrifying. Tony's head snapped to the side, and he pointed towards cell 6, his fingers shaking violently. "They're in there," he hissed. "They want to come out." Nick's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. They want to come out? What was Tony talking about? Without thinking, Nick grabbed Tony's arm and tried to pull him away from the cell. But Tony's grip tightened, his hand like ice as he clutched onto Nick. "They'll never let us leave," Tony mumbled, his voice trembling. "You should have never opened it. We should have never come here." Nick's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew they had to get out of there. Whatever was happening, whatever was haunting this place, it was only growing stronger. With all his strength, Nick forced Tony away from the door. "We have to leave now." But before they could take another step, the temperature dropped even further, and the air was thick with a presence. Something old, something hungry. The walls seemed to groan under the weight of something unseen, and the whispers returned, louder now, circling around them like an invisible storm. "Get out," the whisper said, growing stronger, more insistent. "Get out before it's too late." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the direction of cell 6, followed by a deafening silence. Nick froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. And then, without warning, the door to cell 6 slammed open. The darkness beyond it seemed to swallow the light. In an instant, the room was empty, save for a few shards of broken glass and scattered debris. But the air inside the cell was thick with something else. The whispers became frantic now, rising to a fever pitch until they were screaming, shrill and desperate. Nick's breath caught in his throat. There, in the corner of the cell, a shadow moved. It was human-shaped but distorted, as if it didn't quite belong to this world. The figure stepped forward slowly, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. Nick could barely make out its features, but he knew instantly that it wasn't alive. It was something else, a spirit, an entity that had been trapped here for far too long. "They're free," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been waiting." The shadow stepped closer, and Nick could feel its presence crawling over him, cold and suffocating. He tried to back away, but his feet felt frozen to the floor. Then, in a voice that didn't belong to Tony, it spoke. "You should have never come here." Before Nick could react, the figure lunged toward him, its eyes burning with rage. The last thing Nick heard before everything went black was the sound of the whispers, now louder than ever, filling his mind with the chilling truth. Story 4. It was well past midnight when Officer Jack Monroe sat at his desk, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The shift had been slow, almost unnervingly so. The radio was quiet, and the usual murmur of voices over the comms was absent. A few calls had come in, mostly routine traffic stops and noise complaints, but nothing that really warranted any attention. Jack leaned back in his chair, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was one of those nights where the minutes dragged and the hours felt like they were stretching into eternity. His partner, Officer Sarah Donovan, was in the break room, trying to get some sleep before their next round of patrol. Jack envied her ability to fall asleep anywhere. He had never been able to do that, especially not on nights like this, when something in the air felt wrong. His radio crackled to life, the static sharp in the silence of the room. Jack sat up straighter, reaching for the receiver. "Unit 23, come in," came the voice over the comms, calm and clear. Jack furrowed his brow. He didn't recognize the voice. It was a woman's voice, soft, steady, and completely unfamiliar. He clicked the button on his mic to respond. "Unit 23 here. Who's this?" Jack asked, confused. "This isn't dispatch, is it?" There was a brief pause before the voice responded. "This is Maggie. I have a tip for you." There's a vehicle parked in an alley on Maple Street. The driver is slumped over in the seat. Possible overdose. Jack's stomach tightened. The call was unusual. He had never heard of anyone named Maggie working dispatch, especially not at this hour. He glanced at the radio, unsure whether to respond. He was used to getting tips from dispatch, but they always came through the proper channels. Maggie, he repeated, his voice tinged with suspicion. Are you sure you're with dispatch? There was another pause, longer this time, and then the voice answered with an unsettling calmness. I'm with you, Unit 23. You want to check it out. Don't waste time. Jack hesitated, glancing at the computer screen in front of him. There was nothing on the logs about any Maggie on staff. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he checked the roster. No Maggie. No one by that name worked the night shift. He shook his head, trying to push the thought from his mind. Maybe it was some sort of glitch. Dispatch sometimes used temporary dispatchers from a third-party service when they were short-staffed, though he hadn't heard of any such replacements tonight. And yet, the voice was so calm, so authoritative, it seemed real. Jack grabbed his keys from the desk drawer and stood up. He glanced at Sarah's sleeping form in the break room. She was a heavy sleeper, just as well. He didn't want to wake her for something as trivial as a strange radio call. Maple Street it is, Jack muttered under his breath. He grabbed his flashlight, slid it into his belt, and headed for the door. The night was eerily quiet as he got into his patrol car and pulled out of the station. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars and the occasional pedestrian walking in a hurry to get home. The cold air cut through his window as he drove toward Maple Street, and Jack's thoughts lingered on the voice he had just heard. Who was Maggie? As he made his way through the dark streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been in this neighborhood countless times, but tonight, the streets felt empty in a way that made his skin crawl. It was as though the entire town had emptied out, leaving him alone in the cold, lifeless dark. He turned onto Maple Street, and immediately saw the alley on his left. A single streetlight flickered above the narrow passageway, casting long shadows along the walls of the buildings that lined the street. The alley was deserted, save for an old sedan parked near the curb. Its headlights were dim, and the driver's side window was cracked open. Jack parked his patrol car behind the sedan, his unease growing. He stepped out of the car, hand instinctively resting on his weapon as he walked toward the vehicle. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The air seemed charged, heavy with something unspoken. When he reached the car, he peered inside through the window. The driver was slumped forward, just as Maggie had said. His face was hidden, but there was a dark stain on the seat, a blood-red spot, slowly soaking into the upholstery. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The man was still alive, barely breathing, but he was definitely in trouble. Jack quickly opened the door and knelt beside the man, checking for a pulse. His fingers pressed against the man's neck, and a faint pulse returned. "Hang in there," Jack muttered under his breath, reaching for his radio. "Unit 23 to dispatch. I need an ambulance at Maple Street, alley off of 5th. Possible overdose, victim still breathing. Please respond." Static crackled, but there was no answer. Jack pressed the mic again. "Unit 23 to dispatch," he repeated, frustration creeping into his voice. "Come in, dispatch." But the radio remained silent. He tried once more, but it was no use. The call wasn't going through. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, looking at the radio in confusion. He checked his phone, but there was no signal either. The man in the car groaned weakly, and Jack turned his attention back to him. Suddenly, Jack's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, where something caught his eye, a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the alley. The figure was still watching. "Hey!" Jack shouted, his voice echoing in the empty alley. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't move, just stood there, shrouded in darkness. Jack's hand instinctively went to his gun, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Who was that?" Jack murmured to himself, a cold shiver running down his spine. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the man in the car, but the unease gnawed at him. Something was wrong here. He checked the man's vitals again, hoping for a change, but the pulse was weaker now. He looked up toward the end of the alley. The figure was gone. Then, a voice broke through the silence. "Is he okay?" Jack turned around, startled, but there was no one there. The voice, calm and steady, came from a radio. "Maggie." Jack breathed, his mind racing. The dispatcher who wasn't supposed to be there. I don't understand," Jack said, his voice trembling as he looked around. "Who are you?" The voice responded as if nothing was amiss. "I'm Maggie. I'm here to help. But you need to listen to me." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The same calm voice, the same eerie, authoritative presence. "I'm here to help," Maggie repeated. "You need to keep him alive. You can't let him die. If you don't, you'll never be able to help anyone else." Jack glanced back at the man in the car. His pulse was slowing. Time was running out. And yet, as he held his breath, Jack couldn't help but wonder, who was Maggie? How did she know? How was she speaking to him right now? Jack's hand trembled as he held the radio, the voice of Maggie still echoing in his mind. There was something deeply unsettling about hearing her speak. Her calm, measured tones, as though she had been right there with him the whole time. He looked around the alley again, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the bizarre situation. But the alley remained empty, shrouded in darkness. He glanced back at the man in the car. His breathing was slow, shallow. Jack had to act fast, or the man would slip away, and the strange voice in the radio would have been for nothing. "I need an ambulance now," Jack shouted, more out of desperation than authority. He slammed his fist against the radio, trying to force a response, but the silence was suffocating. Maggie's voice came through once more, smooth and unbothered. "Call 911, but don't expect anyone to answer. You're the only one who can help him. If you don't get him to hospital in the next 15 minutes, he's gone." Jack's eyes widened in panic. 15 minutes? He had no time to waste. He didn't know who this Maggie was or how she knew so much, but he didn't care. The victim needed help. Shit! Jack cursed under his breath. The man in the car wasn't just a routine case. He was someone's brother, father, or friend. He was a person, and Jack had no intention of letting him die in an alley. Without another thought, Jack pulled the man from the car with surprising ease, despite the weight of the situation. He dragged him over his shoulder, staggering under the weight but determined. As he approached his patrol car, he felt the temperature drop suddenly, an unnatural chill that bit through his uniform and numbed his bones. It was as if something cold was surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. His breath came out in a visible puff, which made no sense on a relatively mild spring night. Jack froze, looking around again. He expected to see the dark figure from earlier, but the alley remained empty. Then, Maggie's voice returned. "Don't stop, Officer Monroe. Keep going. You're not alone." The word sent a chill down Jack's spine. He could feel a presence, but there was no one there. His mind raced. How could she know my name? He turned to the man in the car again, who was limp and unresponsive. The situation had become something much larger than a routine overdose case. There was something far more sinister at play here. Jack threw the man into the back of his patrol car, cranked the engine, and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, speeding down the empty streets. The chill didn't let up. It followed him, seeped into his bones, a gnawing discomfort that he couldn't shake. The road ahead was dark and empty, lit only by the pale glow of streetlights that flickered with a strange rhythm. Jack's thoughts raced as he turned the corner onto the main road, heading for the nearest hospital. His radio crackled again. "Maggie, who are you?" Jack's voice was tight with frustration, almost desperate. "How do you know all this? How do you know where I am? How do you know him?" But Maggie's voice was calm, as it always had been. "You'll understand in time, Officer Monroe. But right now you need to save him. You're his only hope." Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. How could she know this? How could she know what was going to happen next? His mind struggled to grasp the logic behind it. There was no way she could know these things. She was just a voice on the other end of the radio. Or was she? Minutes passed like hours, the hum of the engine and the voice of Maggie filling the otherwise oppressive silence. "I'm almost there," Jack muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure if anyone was listening. He wasn't even sure if he was still talking to himself. Was Maggie really there? The logical part of him told him it was just an unexplainable glitch. But the rest of him? The part that couldn't explain the cold that was still creeping under his skin. The part that couldn't explain how she knew things that no one else could possibly know. It was starting to feel like something else. As he sped through a red light, Jack felt the presence once more, a fleeting shadow in his peripheral vision, moving just beyond his line of sight. He jerked his head to the side, heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing there. "Stop looking for answers," Maggie's voice said gently. "You don't need to understand it. You just need to save him." The patrol car screeched to a halt outside the hospital's emergency entrance. Jack jumped out of the car, rushing to the back to pull the victim out. The hospital staff was already waiting, their faces grim as they rushed to help him. Jack stepped back, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The cold had finally lifted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked around quickly, but there was no sign of anyone. No one but the medical staff. The victim was wheeled into the hospital, and Jack stood there for a moment, heart racing, feeling completely out of place. He turned to look at the patrol car, half expecting to see something, anything, out of the ordinary. But nothing, just the quiet hum of the hospital and the sound of his own breathing. Jack stepped back into his car, rubbing his temples as if he could clear away the headache building there. His mind was still reeling from the events of the night. He could still hear Maggie's voice echoing in his head. He turned the key in the ignition, determined to get back to the station. The radio crackled again as he pulled out of the hospital lot. "Good job, Officer Monroe," Maggie said. Jack's stomach dropped. He hadn't said anything into the mic. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking. "Who the hell are you?" The radio crackled again, but this time it was different. The voice was softer, almost wistful. "You'll find out soon enough. Just know I was once where you are. I couldn't save them, but you can. Don't waste your chance, Jack." The line went dead. Jack drove in silence, the weight of Maggie's words settling in his chest. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 3 a.m., and that's when it hit him. The date. Maggie had died on this day, 20 years ago. She was a dispatcher who had been murdered on this very shift. Jack sat in his patrol car, the engine humming softly as he stared at the dashboard, still processing what had just happened. He tried to shake off the dread creeping over him, but it lingered like a thick fog. Maggie had died 20 years ago on this very day, and yet she had spoken to him like she was sitting beside him in the car. Her calm, comforting voice had been a constant presence, guiding him through a situation he would never have been able to navigate on his own. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. What was happening? How could Maggie still be alive in some form, answering calls and giving instructions to officers like she was still working as a dispatcher? It didn't make sense, but he couldn't ignore what had happened. Everything about the night had felt like a surreal nightmare, except it wasn't. It was real. As Jack drove back to the station, he couldn't get the thought of Maggie out of his head. He needed answers. He needed to know who she was, how she had died, and why her voice was still coming through on the radio. He couldn't just let it go. He had to understand. When he arrived at the station, the quiet hum of the building greeted him like a familiar but unwelcome presence. It was late, too late, but Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something important. He needed to talk to someone. He needed to find out more about Maggie. Inside the station, Jack made his way to the break room, where he found Officer Harris sitting at the table, sipping his coffee. Harris looked up as Jack entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he could sense something was wrong. "Jack!" Harris greeted him with a raised eyebrow. "You're still here? Thought you'd be out of here hours ago." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, He took a seat across from Harris and stared at the table. His mind was spinning with everything he had just experienced. Finally, he spoke. "Harris," Jack said slowly, his voice low. "Do you remember Maggie?" Harris's expression shifted. He put down his coffee cup, the quiet clink of porcelain filling the room. "Maggie? The dispatcher?" Harris asked, clearly taken aback. "Yeah, I remember her. She was the one who... Well, she didn't make it, did she?" Jack nodded, his throat tightening. "That's what I thought, too. But tonight, I heard her voice. On the radio. She was giving me instructions, helping me save someone's life." Harris's brow furrowed. "Wait, hold on. Maggie's been dead for over 20 years. She was murdered during a robbery at the station. You're telling me you heard her voice tonight?" Jack's pulse quickened. "Yeah, it was her. Calm, collected, just like she always was. She knew exactly what was happening. She told me everything I needed to know to save that guy." Harris leaned back in his chair, staring at Jack like he was trying to process what he was hearing. "Look, Jack," Harris said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "I don't know what's going on, but there's something you need to understand. Maggie's death, it was never solved. No one ever figured out who killed her, and it's always been one of those mysteries we just have to live with. There are stories around here about her. People claim to hear her voice on the radio sometimes, but it's all just rumors, you know?" Jack's heart raced. "Rumors? What do you mean? You've heard about this too." Harris sighed, his eyes growing distant as he looked down at the table. "Yeah, it's not just me. A few officers claim to have heard her voice on calls. Some of the old-timers say they still hear her sometimes. She was something special. It's almost like she never left. Maybe she's still trying to finish what she couldn't do in life. Help people, save lives. But no one knows why it's happening." Jack absorbed Harris's words, his mind reeling. Maggie's death had always been a tragic event, one that haunted the department. The case had gone cold, and it seemed like no one had ever truly gotten over it. But now, Jack was starting to wonder if Maggie hadn't truly left at all. What if her spirit, or whatever was left of her, was still out there, trying to make up for the lives she couldn't save when she was alive? "I need to know more," Jack said, his voice firm with determination. "Where can I find out what happened to her? What went down during the robbery?" Harris hesitated before standing up. "I can show you the old case files, but they're buried in the archive room. It's a mess in there. They've been untouched for years." Jack stood up, a sense of urgency pushing him forward. "Let's go." They made their way through the dark hallways of the station, the air thick with the weight of forgotten stories. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much larger than a cold case, something much more dangerous. The archive room was dimly lit, filled with rows upon rows of dusty boxes and file cabinets. Harris pulled open one of the cabinets and began flipping through the files, his fingers moving quickly as he searched for the one he needed. "Here," Harris said, pulling out an old file. "This is it, the case that went cold." Jack took the file, the weight of it pressing down on him as he opened it. Inside were notes from the investigation into Maggie's death. The more he read, the darker the truth became. The robbery had been planned by a group of thieves who had targeted the station, and Maggie had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. During the robbery, she had tried to call for help, but the thieves had shot her before she could send out a distress signal. The investigation into her death had gone on for months, but the criminals had never been caught, and the case had eventually been shelved, along with all the unanswered questions. Jack felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had never known the full story. He had never understood the weight of what had happened to Maggie or how her death had impacted the department. But now, he realized that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "I need to go back," Jack muttered under his breath. "I need to go to the station. There's something I'm missing." Harris gave him a skeptical look, but didn't stop him as Jack grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. As Jack walked out of the archive room, the weight of the case file still heavy in his hands, something in the air shifted. The building felt colder, emptier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Story 5. It was a quiet night at the precinct, the kind of night where time seemed to slow down and the officers, more often than not, found themselves battling the stillness. The clock ticked steadily, its rhythm a constant reminder of the long hours stretching ahead. Most of the night shift was just routine, patrolling, responding to minor complaints, making sure the streets stayed empty of trouble. But then the call came through. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, sharp and unsettling. Unit 473, we've got a noise complaint from an abandoned station. It's in the mountains, about 20 miles northeast of town. No one's been out there in years. You're the closest. Respond when ready. The voice on the other end, Officer Blake, paused for a moment, glancing over at his partner, Officer Diaz. The two exchanged a quick look, one of those unspoken moments where they both knew what was coming next. It wasn't a call they could ignore, not when they were the only unit nearby. Besides, it was an easy enough assignment. Diaz nodded, reaching for the radio to acknowledge the dispatch. Unit 473 were en route. Blake started the car, its engine purring to life, breaking the otherwise eerie silence of the night. They drove in the direction the dispatcher had given them, the road becoming progressively narrower as they made their way into the heart of the mountains. The air outside grew colder with every mile, the dense forest around them swallowing any remaining traces of civilization. They could see only the occasional flicker of moonlight piercing through the trees, casting strange, elongated shadows across the landscape. The station they were heading to wasn't anything remarkable. It had been abandoned for as long as Blake and Diaz had been on the force, at least 10 years. It had a reputation, though. Strange rumors had followed it for years, stories that had circulated to the town like wildfire. The locals called it the Forgotten Station, a place no one dared to visit after dark. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it had been the site of some violent altercations long ago. Whatever the reason, it was a place avoided by most. But Blake and Diaz were professionals. They had dealt with strange calls before. So, when they arrived at the station, the only thing they expected was a minor disturbance, a raccoon maybe, or some kids causing trouble. Something simple. As they pulled into the gravel parking lot, the station came into view. It was an old, crumbling building, a shell of what it must have once been. The windows were broken, the roof sagging in places, and vines crawled up the walls like veins of some forgotten creature. The rusting metal of the sign barely legible, reading Station 9. Blake cut the engine, the car immediately falling into a silence that felt unnatural. The station loomed before them, dark and ominous. The hairs on the back of Blake's neck stood up. "This place feels wrong," Diaz muttered, a slight tremor in his voice. Blake ignored him and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Just a noise complaint, Diaz. Let's get it over with." They both grabbed their equipment, stepping out into the cold night air. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. They made their way to the entrance, where a heavy wooden door stood ajar, creaking slightly with every gust of wind. Blake pushed it open with a firm shove. It was dark inside, unnaturally dark. No lights, no signs of life. The interior smelled of mildew and decay, the stale air thick with dust. "Hello," Blake called out, his voice breaking the stillness. His words fell hollow in the empty space. Nothing. No response. Not even an echo. He exchanged a look with Diaz, and they both stepped inside. Their flashlights scanned the area. Desks overturned, broken chairs scattered across the floor, and paper strewn everywhere, most of it long decayed beyond recognition. The place looked like it had been abandoned for much longer than the 10 years it had been. "This is where they're supposed to be?" Diaz asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah, I guess so," Blake replied, stepping further into the building. "Let's check the back." They made their way through the dimly lit halls, the floorboards creaking with every step. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence, amplifying the sense of isolation. It was as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, Blake's radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice, though faint, came through. Unit 473, do you copy? Blake reached the radio, a slight chill running down his spine. Unit 473 here, go ahead. There was a brief pause, followed by static. Then, the dispatcher's voice came through again, barely audible. Just be careful, Blake. There's something strange about that place. Blake frowned, a sinking feeling growing in his stomach. What do you mean? We're just checking out a noise complaint. But the radio went silent. Did you hear that? Diaz asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Blake nodded. He hadn't imagined it. The voice, muffled and distorted by static, was unlike anything he had ever heard before. The sense of unease only grew stronger. Whatever was going on here, it was more than just a simple noise complaint. The two officers continued their search, moving through the building with growing unease. As they reached the back of the station, they found the old holding cells, empty, save for a few broken items scattered about. Blake moved to the last cell at the far end, cell 6, his flashlight beam catching something strange. The wall was covered in strange, black stains, almost as if something had crawled along the surface. It was unlike anything Blake had ever seen before. His stomach churned as he got closer, and that's when it happened. A sharp, guttural sound, like nails scraping against metal, came from behind the wall. Blake froze, his flashlight flickering momentarily before illuminating the room in full. Blake, what the hell is that? Diaz whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Blake could answer, the lights went out entirely, plunging him into darkness. The radio crackled again, this time with nothing but static. And then, just like that, the transmission went silent. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Then, Blake whispered, "We need to get out of here. Now!" But before they could move, a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered from the darkness, "Help." The voice that echoed through the darkness was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the heavy air like a knife. Help. The word was chilling, unnatural, as if it didn't belong in this time or place. Blake's heart skipped a beat. He froze, staring into the pitch-black void around them, trying to locate the source of the voice. It wasn't Diaz. He was standing next to him, equally terrified. "Did you hear that?" Diaz whispered, his breath shaky. Blake nodded, his mind racing. His flashlight flickered again, casting odd shadows on the walls as he slowly turned it toward the source of sound. There was nothing there, just the empty cells, the broken furniture, and the thickening darkness pressing in on them. The weight of the air seemed to get heavier, thicker with each passing second. "Who's there?" Blake called out, his voice far steadier than he felt. His eyes darted around, scanning the room, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread creeping into his bones. Nothing. The silence stretched out, more oppressive than ever. The only sound now was the distant hum of the old air conditioning unit, rattling quietly in the corner of the room. And then, just when Blake thought he might be imagining things, the sound came again. Help. This time, the voice was louder, more desperate, but also distorted, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. The whisper seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the station. Blake's hand tightened around his flashlight. "Diaz, we're not alone here. We need to get out." But before they could react, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. Blake could feel the cold seeping through his uniform, the chill biting into his skin. He glanced at Diaz, who was shivering visibly now. His breath came out in misty clouds, and his face was ashen. "That wasn't like this a second ago," Diaz muttered, his voice barely audible. Blake tried to push his panic down, forcing his mind to focus. He knew he had to stay calm, but every instinct screamed at him to run. Yet, something held him in place. Maybe it was a job. Maybe it was a nagging thought that someone needed help. "We should check the control room," Blake suggested, trying to sound confident. His voice didn't quite reach his own ears, and the words fell hollow. Diaz didn't say anything. He simply nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The two officers moved swiftly, making their way back down the dark hall. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, the sound reverberating unervingly off the old stone walls. They passed the old records room, then the break room. The building felt even colder as they drew nearer to the control room at the far end of the hall. There, they found an old radio console, its blinking lights casting strange, unearthly glows on the walls. The room was still, save for the faint crackling of static on the radio. Blake moved cautiously toward it, holding his breath. He had been in situations like this before, isolated, alone, dealing with disturbances that could be explained away. But something about this felt different. There was an undercurrent of wrongness that he couldn't shake. The hairs on his neck stood on end as he reached for the radio. He flicked the switch, and immediately the room was filled with static. He adjusted the dial, but the noise only grew louder, more oppressive. And then amid the static, a voice broke through. "Help, please." Blake froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same as the one they had heard earlier. But this time, it wasn't coming from the darkness. It was coming from the radio itself, as if someone or something was speaking directly into the receiver. He glanced over at Diaz, who looked just as terrified. Diaz took a shaky step forward, his eyes locked on Blake. "What the hell is going on, Blake? We need to leave now." But Blake wasn't listening. He was focused on the radio, his mind racing. There had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. Maybe it was interference. Maybe it was some sort of prank. But the voice, it sounded too real. Too desperate. "Who are you?" Blake asked, his voice quiet but firm. There was a long pause. The static crackled, almost as if the radio was struggling to process his words. And then it came again. "Help before it's too late." The message was clear. Someone or something was trapped here, begging for salvation. Blake's heart raced as the words reverberated through his skull. He turned to Diaz. "We need to find out who's behind this. Who's calling?" But as he looked at Diaz, something in his partner's expression changed. His eyes widened with horror. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He was staring at something behind Blake. Blake spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. Nothing. There was nothing there. But Diaz's eyes didn't move. His expression was locked in terror, and his whole body was trembling. Slowly, he raised a finger, pointing toward the far corner of the room. Blake's gaze followed Diaz's finger, and his breath caught in his throat. In the far corner, where the shadows pooled thickest, there was something moving, something small. And it was crawling. It was a figure. At least, Blake thought it was. The way it moved was unnatural, jerking and twisting as it crawled along the floor, its limbs contorting at strange angles. It was too dark to see clearly, but Blake could make out the shape. Its movements were wrong. Too fast, too erratic, as if it were fighting against its own body. Blake's mind raced. "Diaz, get back. Get the hell out of here." But it was too late. The crawling figure stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Blake could feel the cold seeping into his very bones. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick and heavy. And then, as if reacting to the presence of the officers, the figure turned. Slowly, painfully. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Blake could make out the jagged edges of mouth, a wide, twisted grin that seemed to stretch impossibly across its face. The figure's eyes, dark, hollow, and devoid of any humanity, locked onto Blake. The voice from the radio, the one they had heard before, suddenly echoed through the room once more. "Help before it's too late." Blake's legs felt like they were made of stone. His body refused to move. The figure was getting closer, its contorted form dragging itself across the cold, filthy floor. And then, before he could react, it let out a blood-curdling scream, a shrill, high-pitched wail that shook the very foundations of the building. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, into thin air. Blake stood frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. Blake, we need to get out now. Diaz's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but Blake didn't respond. His mind was reeling. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it was here, and it wasn't alone. Blake's head spun as the room settled back into an eerie stillness. He could still feel the presence of the thing, no, the things, that had been there, watching them, waiting for them. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if something had shifted in the very fabric of the building. He glanced at Diaz, who was visibly shaken, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Did you see it? Did you see its eyes? Diaz gasped, his voice barely audible. Blake could only nod, the cold fear creeping further into his veins. He had seen those eyes, hollow, soulless, and dark like endless pits. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't of this world. It had been waiting for them, watching them from the shadows, and now it knew they were here. Blake didn't know what it wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. It didn't want them to leave. We need to get out, Blake. Now, Diaz urged, his voice cracking as he turned toward the door. Blake was still frozen in place. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in like a vice. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from here as possible. But something held him back. He had been trained for situations like this. He had faced danger before. He had been in life-or-death situations. But this was different. This felt wrong on a level he couldn't explain. Blake, please. Diaz's voice was frantic now, pulling him out of his daze. Blake finally snapped out of his trance, nodding quickly. Right. Let's go. The two of them turned toward the door. But as Blake reached for the handle, a bone-chilling screech echoed through the building. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, a banshee's wail mixed with a shriek of metal tearing apart. It felt like the entire building was vibrating with the force of it. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, throwing them both back into the room. Blake hit the ground hard. The air knocked from his lungs. He gasped, scrambling to get back on his feet, as the entire station seemed to groan and shift. God damn it! Diaz yelled, trying to get to the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pushed, pulled, or banged against it, it stayed shut, as if something was holding it closed from the other side. The temperature in the room plummeted, a frigid wave of cold washing over them. Blake's breath came out in visible puffs, the freezing air biting at his skin. His hands trembled, but not from the cold. No, it was something deeper than that, something more primal. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. Blake glanced around, searching for another way out. The only other exit was a window, but it was too high for either of them to reach. His mind raced, but nothing made sense. What had happened to First Squad Car? Where had they gone? What was the thing they had seen crawling on the floor? And then the voice returned. Help. Blake froze once more, the voice cutting through the air like a knife. It was clear now, familiar. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a command. Get out. The voice was now coming from the walls, from the floor, from every corner of the room. It surrounded them, filling every inch of space. It was suffocating, disorienting, as if the building itself was alive with the voices of the dead. Diaz was shaking uncontrollably now, his eyes wide in terror as he backed away from the walls, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Blake could see his partner's lips moving, but there were no words, only silent pleas for mercy. Blake reached for his radio, hoping against hope that he could call for backup, but when he clicked the button, there was nothing but static. His heart sank. The radio had been working before. It had been their lifeline. But now it was useless. Blake, we're not alone, Diaz whispered, his voice cracked with fear. Blake didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the walls, on the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, taking on strange, contorted shapes. He saw the outlines of figures in the darkness, figures that didn't belong. Help before it's too late. The voice, louder now, more urgent, came from everywhere. It echoed through his mind, clawing at his sanity. Blake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice was inside him now. It was in his head, in his thoughts, repeating the same words over and over again. Help before it's too late. Blake's heart raced as the darkness in the room seemed to grow, to shift. He could feel it closing in on him. The walls were moving, stretching out, growing larger as the room expanded. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Blake understood. The room wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a place designed to hold him here, to trap them in the endless night, surrounded by the tortured souls of those who had never escaped. And those voices, they were the voices of the lost, the ones who had vanished in the night, swallowed by the darkness. The first squad car, the missing officers, this was their fate now. They were a part of the building, their souls twisted into the walls, their screams forever trapped in the cold air. Blake turned to Diaz, his throat tight. We have to get out. Now! But Diaz wasn't listening. He was staring at something. Someone across the room. Blake's stomach twisted. He followed Diaz's gaze, and his blood ran cold. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A man. His face was pale, ghostly, and his eyes were dark, empty sockets, lifeless. The figure was wearing a uniform. It was a police uniform. Blake's breath caught in his throat. It was one of them, one of the missing officers, the one who had disappeared without a trace. The figure lifted its head, slowly, and then its lips parted. Help before it's too late. And then, in an instant, the figure lunged at them, its body moving with unnatural speed. Blake didn't have time to react before it was upon him, its cold, clammy hands gripping his throat. The room spun around him, and all he could hear was a voice. The voice, repeating its chilling command, growing louder and louder until everything else faded away. Help before it's too late. The end. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the eerie tale we just shared. If you found it unsettling or captivating, don't forget to hit that like button, comment below with your thoughts or theories, and subscribe to Mr. Dar's Nights for more spine-chilling stories just like this one. Remember to turn on the bell notification so you never miss a new tale of terror. Until next time, stay safe and always watch your back.